which I will put the report, and I just need a seconder for this report, which is really that we're receiving the information. Councillor Condi is, probably you can definitely second. I imagine that there is no debate because this is very much a procedural part of the meeting. So I now put the motion which has been moved and seconded, and now you may vote accordingly. Got people who are quick off the mark here. Where is it? Everyone voted? Oh, I think you're on silent, Cyrus.
That's unanimous.
Cool, thank you. That's fantastic. All right, so I'd like to thank our submitters who are joining us today for taking the time to come and talk to us and tell us your whakaaro, your thoughts about the parking policy. It would be appreciated just when you're doing your submission if you try to put it into your own words rather than reading from the submission, because we have the submissions in front of us. So you're hearing the bits that are really important to you and what you would like us to interact with you during that time. And if you're presenting as an individual today, you have 5 minutes, and it is worth leaving some time for some questions in there. Also, if you're here for an organisation, then you do have 10 minutes, and again, try and allow for some time within there for questions. After you've presented, you're very much welcome to continue watching the meeting via the live stream link that you will have received in the email before the meeting. So please do feel free to watch after you've presented. But we will get underway. So I'd like to welcome Raewyn Hales, who is here representing the CCS Disability Action Wellington Group. Welcome, Raewyn, and yeah, we look forward to hearing from you. So you just need to make sure you turn your mic off. And
Good morning. I'm not sure why my camera's not working, but anyway, some of you will know me already. To those of you that don't, I'm Raewyn Hales, and I'm the Access Coordinator for CCS Disability Action. This morning, I don't want to go through our submission, but I do want to take you on a little bit of a journey. So, the CCS supports primarily all the objectives of the parking policy. We've worked closely with the policy team on getting it to this stage and really look forward to seeing it come into action. So the policy covers many areas of parking and future growth of the city. Of course, this impacts on all people, and getting the landscape of future Wellington to be a city that works for all is a very desirable outcome. CCS Disability Action manages the mobility parking database across New Zealand as a service to the disabled community. While we support most aspects of the parking policy, today I really want to take you on a little bit of a journey to focus on mobility car parks. Could I have the next slide, please, Cyrus? So in the slide, if you're a wheelchair user, the first picture, this person may have gotten up this morning and decided to go for a swim. So he's got up, got dressed, of course, gone through the usual procedures in the morning that we all do, and then loaded into the car. So got into the car, put his wheelchair in the car, and driven to the swimming pool for his morning exercise at, let's say, Kilburnie Recreational Pool. So when he gets there, there's no accessible mobility car park because it's being used by somebody who is dropping children off for their swim lessons. So he parks around the back of the building and goes for his swim, of course having to unload his wheelchair, get in the wheelchair, wheel to the facility, have a swim, and then wheel back and get into the vehicle, take his wheelchair into the vehicle, and then drive to the next thing, which could well be a meeting at Wellington City Council on the terrace. Once he gets there, he's only able to get a car park, a mobility car park down by St Andrews on the terrace, has to again unload the chair, get in the chair, wheel up the hill, have the meeting and reverse the process. from there, possibly wanting to go and get some supermarket shopping before returning home. So repeat the process. So you can imagine how exhausting all of this is. And I hear you say, well, why don't you just use an ordinary mobility, an ordinary car park and not a mobility park? So mobility parks are wider than regular car parks and make it really much easier for people to get their wheelchair in and out of a car. Most of the car parks in Wellington are not wide enough for easy access for people using any sort of mobility aid. So what I would like you to think about today in our request for a lot more mobility car parks in the CBD and in the suburbs is to think about the impact that this has on people who use mobility aids. So the next picture is a mum with a young child in a wheelchair, and for families with children who use mobility aids, this is very much the same process. It's a constant effort of lifting both the child and the wheelchair in and out of vehicles. The next photo is Captain Tom, who we've all seen recently doing his walk, and he can obviously walk quite a long way, but he needs flat ground and a mobility aid to be able to walk. And you'll notice, if you recall, you'll notice that he shuffled quite a lot. So having a mobility car park when you have a walker or a walking stick is essential also for being able to open the door wide enough of the vehicle to get out of the vehicle easily, to get, even if you have an assistant or somebody there with you to get your wheelchair, to get your walker or wheelchair out, you still need the room to actually be able to manoeuvre out of the car. And even with just a walking stick as an aid, it is still a requirement for quite a bit more space. So too often people with disability don't get a fair go. So that's why we're asking you to give this consideration. So if you are an electric wheelchair user, you need the additional space because usually your chair is quite large, and with cars parked quite close together, it's very, very difficult to get out. And if you have a vehicle that backloads, quite often another vehicle would be parked right up behind you. So this makes a real difference to people's lives and being able to go about the ordinary everyday things in life that the rest of us take for granted. Could I have the next slide, Cyrus, please? So in defining the city space, where would we like to see the mobility car parks? We'd like to see a lot of mobility car parks in the city, close to medical practices, physiotherapists, dentists, supermarkets, banks, schools and education centres and recreational centres. We hear from council staff that the monitoring of mobility car parks shows them to be underutilised. However, I know that there are some spaces in the CBD in Bunny Street where there are no parking restrictions and no charge currently that are full all day, every day. So it's about putting the parks in the locations that make the most benefit for the people who need them. So I guess that is the main focus of what I want to say to you this morning, is that we have large numbers of mobility parks. Have I got another slide there, Cyrus, please? So in Wellington, we have 3,566 mobility parking permit holders. So those people have applied for via their GP and met the criteria to get a parking permit. 28 of those only are in the CBD. So the rest of the people that hold those permits would drive into the city. If we include the Greater Wellington region, this brings the number up to around 10,000 people. Through the suburbs, they range from one permit holder in Naranga 2 in Papatia through to the higher numbers of 380 in Tawa, 297 in Karori, 283 in Johnsonville, and 282 in Miramar, and everything in between in the other suburbs. So this is not about just the central city, and I hope that you will extend your thinking through to the suburbs and the shopping centres that we have in the suburbs, so that people can access and return to doing business in our city and also in the suburban areas. So that's really all that I wanted to say, and there's my contact details for you, and happy to take any questions.
Ngā mihi, Raewyn, for your kōrero. Councillors, do you have any questions for Raewyn on her presentation? Councillor Foon.
Kia ora, Raewyn. Just want to thank you for bringing that discussion today, and I just need to let you know I do have a family with a CCS car park, and I know how grateful they are for it, because it really helps Mum and my sis have some decent access to great things going on in town. I do have a question that has worried me a little bit, and it is one of those community discussions, but I did hear in Brooklyn that there's a person that comes and parks on the mobility park all day. She comes, drives there, and then catches a bus and then comes back and picks up her car. And I just wonder, is there, at night, is there any way that there is communication around the mobility, the community that need the parks, that they also need to be mindful of others that need them to, to create the same turnover?
I guess that depends on enforcement, and enforcement has been kept completely separate from the parking policy development. So in my mind, they go hand in hand. So if there's no time limit on the park, then that one person can, quite selfishly, I suppose, use the park all day. And if there is a time limit, then we do have a phone app called Access Aware, where people can make reports of parking abuse, and that alerts council parking services of the abuse in real time, so that they can actually do something about it. And in some cases, we've had a great response to people being held to the correct parking time limits.
Thank you.
Thanks, Raewyn.
Thank you. Councillor Young, and then Councillor Matthews.
Thanks, Raewyn. So I am acutely aware of how important these parks are for when my parents were old. They're past that stage now, though, so it's no longer a problem. But just thinking of these stats, the sort of horrifying figure of the very few parks in the central city. But I wonder, are these council car parks you're talking about? Because there are also, for example, at the supermarkets, they have mobility parks. Are those private ones included in your figures or not?
No, private car parks, there's no requirement in legislation to enforce, and it's up to the individual owner of the park. So I'm talking specifically around on-road parking, council on-road parking.
Right, so there would be, I mean, possibly not many, but there would be a few more. I mean, I know at my medical centre, for example, there are mobility parks there. So the figures, I mean, while still poor, aren't quite as bad, but clearly we have to do something about this. So just interested. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Councillor Matthews.
Kia ora, Raewyn, and thank you so much for your submission and all of your advocacy that you do. I just wanted to check with you, because you talked a lot about the number of car parks, which we know is an issue, and we've explicitly put it in the policy that we need to address that. But have you got any comment about the whether the car parks are actually fit for purpose? Because that's some feedback that we also get, that potentially they're not wide or enough for the bigger chairs, and or they're unsuitable for some other reason.
Yeah, in an ideal world, if we had the space, if we made all car parks that little bit wider and that little bit longer, then they would suit everybody. But as they're so few and far between, and that they are such a lifeline for people who need them to be able to go about their daily business. I feel that we do need more on council provided property. So in the building code, in the private space, it depends on how many car parks are provided, but in most instances you'll only see 1 or 2 car parks. So it is adding to the total, but it's certainly, if we want people to return to the city and to return to boost the economy with the spend, we do need to make sure that people can access easily the places that they need to get to.
Thank you.
Tēnā koe, Manoa Raewyn. Thank you for coming in to talk to us today, taking that time. We really appreciate you sharing those perspectives with us. It's very helpful.
Thank you for having me.
Great. No, my Marion Layton. Now, I just need to confirm, looking at your submission, Marion, that you were submitting as an individual, were you, or are you?
Well, I always come with my hospital and doctor's hat attached to me, so it kind of doesn't matter. I will be speaking to health today. Okay,
it depends on the 5 or the 10 minutes. That's the only thing. I don't want to cut you short if you were here, representing a group. That's the only thing.
That's okay. I know I was given 5 minutes, so I've prepared for 5, and I can have more if you've got more time.
Thank you so much, Marion. I'll let you get started. Thank you.
Okay. So yes, we've met many times before now. So here we go again. This time on parking. And particularly I want to, in order to not just repeat myself again and again, and hopefully in order not to repeat things that I suspect other people are going to say, I want to focus on some health equity issues. And I know as a council, you really do want to look at this, and often don't get submissions from people who might be from minority groups and those who need others to speak on their behalf. So equity, of course, we're talking about fairness and justice and resource distribution guided by community need. To create equal opportunities. And from my perspective, this is for physical activity, equal opportunities to healthy food choices and the associate benefits, regardless of a person's ability. When it comes to parking, 1 in 8 Wellingtonian households don't own a car. So I know, we talk about we're all this car mad community and country, but actually a lot of people don't. And the people who are most likely to not own a car are not the weirdo cyclists, it's the poor people. Households earning at less than 50,000 a year are much more likely to own only 1 car or no cars, and those earning over 100,000 a year are much more likely to have 3 or more cars. So even if they've got off-street parking, they may well be parking on the street as well and fighting for those car parks. I'm sure in my submission talked about mobility car parks, just as Raewyn has, but we've also got to really focus on, again, that equity of access to people being able to move around our cities. And while 80% of disabled men in New Zealand are drivers, this drops down to 65% when you look at women. And when you look at ethnicity, it's down to only 48% of Pacifica adults, male or female. And for those with intellectual disability, it's right down to 33%. So those people, while yes, a number of people need mobility car parks, all of those people need to be able to use public transport, modified bicycles, they need wider pavement so it's easier to get around. And so for equity purposes, we've got to focus on provision for everyone. And if that means widening pavements, having more bike lanes and the like in order to achieve this equity, we may need to remove standard car parks. And we need to be brave about that. When most people talk about a lack of parking, generally they're talking about parking that is free and within 1 minute's walk of their destination at peak times. And we cannot just rely and make all of our planning for that purpose, because that's what people are complaining about. In Japan, very highly densely populated island, there is no on-street parking at all. And when you buy a car, you have to register it and you have to prove you have a place to park it that does not use the public infrastructure. So it's not that we can't do it. Other countries, other cultures do it. We just have to start getting people to do things differently. Okay, that's me for this time. Thank you.
Kia ora, Marion. Do we have any questions, councillors, for Marion? Oh, that was a bit of an equal one there. Councillor Pennant and then Deputy Mayor Free.
Thanks. So I don't need to go first. Marion, that was a really, really useful submission. So are you able just to tell us where you get all that data from?
Mostly it's from looking at, there's bits of Statistics New Zealand. There's a really good public health document that was written for the Ministry of Health sometime in the last 7 years or so, I think 2015, to try and guide some of this sort of planning. Of course, I suspect it's fallen into the Ministry of Health and never came back out again, but it is, I mean, really just Googling is where you can find a lot of this stuff. There's some stuff written from, again, 2015, I think, for Auckland around it. And of course, one of our problems for really up-to-date information is we don't have information from the 2018 census, and that information was flawed. So that makes things a little bit more tricky. But yeah, it's just a case of seeking it out and then putting it together.
That's fantastically helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor Free.
Thank you, Marion, and thank you for your ongoing advocacy for all of our active modes. But my question really is about public transport. If we were to move to, say, an aspiration of one, at the most, one car per household, what do you think would have to change with our public transport to make that actually possible?
This is expensive. I'll do the sigh, because the problem with public transport, and I know you're all aware of this, is in order to get people to change, you're going to have some doubling up time. We need much more frequent buses. I mean, actually, the ones like the number 1 and the number 3 that run every 10 minutes, that's great. But you need more frequent buses going to the places people want to go. You possibly need more frequent buses doing the suburb, the less frequented streets, so that people don't have to walk a long way to a bus. Although again, if you make bus transport really cheap, cheaper than parking, and easy for people to get around on, then people will be prepared to walk further to a bus stop to get it. They do in other cities, including places colder and with more inclement weather than Wellington. And you need to make it so that it becomes the cultural norm. I mean, the free, dare I say, cities that have gone for free bus transport, COVID does make things a little bit more difficult because people have got other concerns, have really been a game changer for getting people out of their cars and getting people used to using it. But you can't run buses that are just chocker full at peak times and then everyone's standing there waiting for another bus to come and another bus to come and they're late. You've got to make it easy and simple for them to get on that bus and get to where they need to go, and for it to be quicker and easier than cheaper than taking the car.
And I guess 24, 7-day-a-week services too, because if you can't get in the weekends, you'll need a car.
Yeah, and I don't know who oversees the buses, but even, for instance, to Newtown, which is like a super easy suburb to get to, during the day, no problem at all. You get to the evening and 3 buses all run within 5 minutes of each other every half an hour. You know, those could easily be spread out. And so I don't know who's looking at the overall planning of those timetables, but there are lots of weird hiccups in those timetables that make it much more difficult for people to get around. But loads of other places have solved this public transport issue, and everyone agrees those are better cities to live in. You know, we can do it too.
It's a regional council, but we should take an interest, I think.
Well, ngā mihi, Dr. Marion Layton, i te kōrero. Thank you for coming in today and sharing your perspective. It's very helpful. You obviously do have a very good view over all sorts of parts of our community, so really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillors, Bernard O'Shaughnessy is not here at this point. I will just add him later onto the list. I think officers are sort of struggling to get in touch at this stage, so we'll just continue to follow that up, and I'll keep that one open. So we'll move on to Jonathan Fletcher now. Jonathan, no mai. And so same thing for you, 5 minutes, and if you want to allow some time for questions, that would be great. Thank you.
Marina, and thank you very much for the opportunity. My key reason for presenting here this morning is to demonstrate some support for your proposed policies from an older suburban resident, because I think so often you hear from the central city people and not enough support from the suburbs. My main focus is on the policies for the central city, and for that I'm keen to see a transport hierarchy that in order of priority provides for active transport, public transport, and then thirdly private transport. And parking policy seems to me to be one of the keys to managing that hierarchy and managing that accessibility and getting some of the things that Marion talked about in terms of equity. I lived in Christchurch for 20 years and was a cycle commuter there. With the advent of e-bikes, which would considerably help my aging legs overcome the hilly terrain, I'd like to continue cycle commuting. However, I don't feel safe. And until I can cycle commute without having to compete for space with motor vehicles, I'm not going to do it. And that means dedicated cycleways and shared footpaths. Perhaps more importantly, I'm not comfortable with my grandchildren cycling until they can do the same, until I can feel that they can cycle safely. And getting them to cycle seems to me to be, at a young age, seems to me to be key for the future of a sustainable, carbon neutral transportation system. So my first point is that dedicated cycleways and shared footpaths are a priority. And if the price for that is that we lose some parking space, well, so be it. It's a price well worthwhile paying. Secondly, I take a rooms and corridors view of the central city. People need to get there by a range of transport means, but once there, they move around on foot and need to feel safe, and that the space belongs to the pedestrians and the mobility scooters and not to the cars. So nearly all motorised transport should be kept out of that pedestrian area, and any within it should move very slowly. And I note Dunedin's recent moves, and drivers should feel that they're there trespassing on pedestrian areas. My third thing is that policy and provision should make it easier, cheaper, and more attractive to go to and from by active or public transport than by private vehicles. Once you get there, then public transport and active transport will be a winner. So parking policy is a key to this hierarchy, and mine envisages that provision for public transport stops and cycle parks on the close fringes of the pedestrians' centralised city area. So the priority of those close-in parking spaces should be for mobility card holders, public transport and cycles. So if you get there by those means, you can park closest to your destination. The relatively few close and convenient public car parking spaces provided for vehicles should be priced and timed for short duration stops, the picking up and dropping off of items. You should do it only when you have to, and it should cost you. Longer parking, say up to 3 hours, long enough for an appointment or lunch, should be further away, less convenient than the bus stop, and more expensive. And I think you could use the current coupon parking areas for these sorts of purposes. At the moment, the coupon parking areas seem to me to provide a reasonably low cost way for commuter parking. And I think those days are gone. There will need to be, I accept, limited provision for longer parking, the commuter park, but these should be further away and significantly more expensive than public transport. So it should cost you more and be less convenient than coming in by public transport. There are several points in this hierarchy that I recognise are difficult for you, because and the first point is that to be effective, the council needs to get control of the policies and practices of those people who provide private parking, the parking buildings, the people who provide private parking for profit, because unless you can control the policies and practices of those, you're fighting this battle with your one hand tied behind your back.
Time's nearly run out.
Okay, sorry,
Jonathan, I'm just wondering if you want any questions.
Okay, my last point then is that park and ride should be significantly increased. That touches on the use of public transport. And again, I appreciate that that's not a matter within your control largely, but it is a matter, I think, for you to have dialogue with the appropriate authorities. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Sparrow, I'll allow you to ask a question if you can be very quick.
It is a reasonably quick question. Thank you for that, Jonathan. My question is simply, in alert level 4, did you Did you get to do much cycling yourself? And if so, how did you find that?
Oh, and alert, well, I mean, alert level 4 did nothing for the hills, but it did do an awful lot for the public space. And, you know, I could cycle and walk in alert level 4 and be relaxed about my safety. So yes, it was a vast improvement.
Thank you.
Ngā mihi, Jonathan. Thank you for sharing your experiences and your thoughts with us today. We really appreciate that.
Thank you.
And you're welcome to continue watching via the live stream as well. Ngā mihi, Patrick Morgan. You want to come off mute and can turn on your video. So Patrick, just confirming, are you here today representing Cycle Aware Wellington? I couldn't see in the submission that was filled in and how long you're expecting to be speaking for today.
Yeah, hi Jill, I appreciate your time is precious. So today I'm representing Cycling Action Network. The national network includes people who live and visit Wellington.
So you have 10 minutes.
Yeah, I'll do my best. 5 or 10 will be fine.
Cool, thanks
Great.
Patrick.
Thank you, Jill. Thank you everyone for your attention. I'm really delighted to see this policy. I think it's a really key part of how we make our city work better. And I think it's really helpful to ask the right question. The question is not, how do we provide parking for everyone who wants it? The question is, what kind of city do we want? And then what parking policy will support that? So I think it's good to put that the right way around. And putting people first should be at the heart of our decision making. So let's start with values. What kind of city, what kind of community are we? One that cares for people and provides access for all ages and abilities, as we've heard from Raewyn. Our values include that we share public space fairly, our streets are safe, comfortable and attractive. We support people running businesses, we look for value for money, and we do our bit for a stable climate. I think this policy takes us in that direction, so I support it. I note that every great city has a parking problem. It means that lots of people want to go there. If you solve parking by creating more and more of it, you destroy what makes a place attractive. People love cities where walking, biking and public transport are easy, as we've heard from Marion. Did you ever hear anyone say, wow, I went on holiday to Detroit or Houston. It was great. There was so much parking. That's really not what attracts people to live in a city or visit it. I'd note that this policy is consistent with the direction of the city, with planning for growth, innovating streets and Te Atakura first to zero. In 2014, students from Victoria and Otago universities carried out a study of Tory Street to see to what degree was on-street parking essential for people shopping there. They found out that only 6% of people shopping on Tory Street were using on-street parking. I think what that shows is that people often overestimate how important on-street parking is to the life of a city. I got some numbers from your offices, and there's around 28,000 car parks in central Wellington City, and only 11% of these are on street. And I think this is space that often can be repurposed for more productive uses. People sometimes think that without cars inside our cities, our economy will tank. How do we look at Tokyo? It's got the highest GDP per capita in Japan and the lowest number of cars per capita. It really stresses the importance of giving people more transport choices, great public transport, walking and cycling. It's the same in the US. New York City has the highest GDP and the lowest number of cars per capita. One thing that really helps us sell the concept of parking reform is an idea from US Professor Donald Shoup. You may have seen his work. His seminal book is called The High Cost of Free Parking, where he argues that the costs of free parking are borne by all of us as it's absorbed through the city and through our economy. And he's got 3 recommendations. Number 1, cities should charge a fair market price for on-street parking. Then I really like his next idea, spend the revenue from that parking to benefit the area in which the parking is. So, for example, if the city in the future decides to charge for parking in Newtown to level the playing field there, that revenue could be invested in improving community facilities in Newtown. That really helps us sell the benefits to communities. His third recommendation is to remove off-street parking requirements, which tend to artificially put up the price of housing and businesses, even where people don't need that. Okay, I think I'll leave it there to allow some time for questions. Thank you for your attention.
Kia ora, Patrick. So our first question is from Councillor Rush.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Hi, Patrick. So you mentioned, you know, this narrative around cities being people-focused and wanting to help businesses. We're currently consulting on a pop-up cycleway down Evans Bay Parade, which will remove 150 car parks. So that will affect the workers at my daughter's early childhood centre, High Five, along with two others. The Bella Vista Motel, they've got workers who need to park on the street. There's multiple high density apartment blocks all along there that use the road in order to park. The Greta Point Cafe will go broke probably. So I'm just trying to understand, where does those sort of considerations fit into your narrative around a people-focused city? Because these are all people. Just because they drive and use car parks doesn't mean they're not Wellingtonians and don't deserve some consideration.
Absolutely. So, you know, the way the city is moving is to give people more transport choices. Unfortunately, our city has invested for too many decades in a transport system that really, it effectively forces people to drive because people lack choices. As you'll note, public transport around that route is not as good as it could be. If we give more people more choices, like make biking viable and improve public transport, we no longer force people to be tied to driving. And in fact, that's one of the best things a city can do, particularly at this time of economic stress, is to lift the burden of forcing people to drive. Many of our households have 2, 3, 4 vehicles. Reducing the costs of transport is one of the best things the city can do.
Okay.
Thank you. Got any other questions, councillors?
Can I just follow up, Madam Chair?
Sure.
I mean, so over what period of time should that sort of transition sensibly take, given the sensitivities around some of the current, you know, users and businesses and so forth?
Sure, I appreciate that. I mean, it's really important for the council and the community to tell the story about why we're changing the way our city streets work, what the costs are, what the benefits are, and why that's happening. That's a really important task for council to do. So I really encourage councillors and your comms people to you know, keep telling that story. This is about giving people more choices, lifting the economic burden, and making life easier for people of all ages and abilities.
And over what
time? In terms
of
time frame, well, you do the maths on climate change. You know, we've got till 2030 in the First to Zero plan. We're looking for a rapid transition to give people more transport choices and make our city to do our bit on addressing the climate crisis.
Kia ora. I'm going to call time on that now, and thank you very much, Patrick, for coming in today and for sharing your experiences and your vast knowledge about Wellington. Really appreciate that. Yeah, and so you can continue to watch if you would like.
Thanks for your attention and for your questions.
Thank you. Haere Tim, welcome. So you've got 5 minutes. If you want to allow some time for questions, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you, and kia ora koutou. I think I'm going to echo what a number of other submitters have already said today. Fundamentally, I support, in broad terms, the parking policy. In particular, I want to say that I support the fact that the council is considering parking in the light of its other and broader commitments. In the light of the commitments under Te Atakora First to Zero to front load emissions reductions between now and 2030, and in the light of Let's Get Wellington Moving's commitment to reduce dependence on private motor vehicles. parking, and in particular the provision of parking which is where there's too much of it or it's not priced sufficiently high, is one of the things that reinforces dependence on private motor vehicles. Now, I want to say here that I agree with the first speaker and a number of the other speakers that the provision of mobility parking is an important goal for the city. But if we provide too much on-street parking, then, and if we price it too low, then it encourages people to drive, including those who could use other modes. It takes up street space, not a thing that we are over blessed with here in Wellington, given our geography. It takes up street space that could otherwise be used to provide more space for walking, for cycling, and for micromobility. And it also reduces the space we can make available for public transport and mass transit. It makes moving around the city more difficult. So I support the council's approach, which seems to me to be reflecting the sustainable transport hierarchy, where walking, cycling, I'm not sure if it's explicitly there in the hierarchy in its current form, but now micromobility as well is at the top. And I should also add that cars aren't the only things that need to park. We also need to provide more parking for bikes, more parking for e-scooters. And so I'm pleased to see that recently the council's been taking good steps in that direction. Now, in terms of the details of the policy, I've already said that I think the approach to the hierarchy is good. I also think that you've got the different approaches you're proposing in different parts of the city broadly right. The key thing, though, in order to meet our climate goals and the goal to reduce dependence on private vehicle use, is we have to make sure that we are reducing the overall provision of parking, not just reallocating it from some parts of the city to other parts. And I guess my concern is that the proposals for the inner city still prioritise short stay parking too highly, because short stay parking still takes up space. So I'd like to see short stay parking drop to the medium priority category. And as other submitters have said, it's important to price it so that it genuinely, in the central city in particular, it genuinely is short stay parking, that it's not parking that people are going to use to store their private vehicle on public land for hours and hours. So those are my main points, and I'm happy to take any questions that people have.
Kia ora, Tim. Councillors, do you have any questions? Councillor Condi.
Hi, Tim. Do you want to unpack what short stay means to you then? If we're talking about, you think that short stay parking is too highly prioritised, are we talking P15 or are you talking 2-hour parking? What do you have in mind there?
Well, I guess, yeah, perhaps I'm not using the term short stay correctly, but what I'm thinking about is particularly 2-hour parking. Do we need to either make that limit lower or increase the price so that it is less likely that people are going to park their cars on street for up to 2 hours, for 2 hours to run a whole bunch of errands in the central city?
Well, kia ora, Tim. Thank you very much for coming in today. We've come to the end of your time, so we won't have time for any other questions at the moment, but thank you very much. And you're welcome to continue to watch via the live stream. Morena Isla, welcome. Thank you for coming in to have a kōrero with us today. So you have 5 minutes for your submission, and if you do want to allow a little bit of time for questions within that 5 minutes, that would be great.
Kia ora koutou. Can you hear me fine?
Yeah.
Hey, thank you all for your time. It's a pleasure to be able to speak in front of the City Council today. So my name's Stewart, and I'm a resident of the Pukehinau Lambton ward. So I wanted to begin with an example of a car park outside my own house. Now, I'm on the fringes of the Wellington CPD, and this car park, it goes for $3.50 an hour to $2.50 an hour. And this car park, it's almost always completely full, chocker. But there's a private lot beside it that goes for $4.50 an hour. What this means is that the price of that council car park is between 22% and 44% subsidised by the ratepayer. Now, this isn't even counting the car parks outside the city being given away for free. Now, we multiply that over thousands of car parks inside the city and on the fringes, and each one of these parks are paid for by the ratepayers and paid for by all of us in land that could have been used for more productive activities. But then it gets worse, because the council's minimum parking requirements require certain properties that have minimum levels of parking. And a 2015 article from CityLab compared prices of places with parks compared to those without. And what they found was very interesting: a 50% rise in rents. Now, this is ultimately paid for by all of us, both in higher rates and higher rents that drive up the cost of goods in Wellington. And when rates are proposed to rise 5% and then 12% after, we simply can't afford this. We're in a housing crisis and we can't afford this. Now, for this reason, I have the following points on the parking policy. Number one, I support the council's move to demand pricing, and I would support changing the car parking prices to fair market value, both inside the city and outside, once the COVID-19 crisis ends. Number two, I would like to see the minimum parking laws abolished. Developers should be able to choose the most effective way to use their land. We should move from free parking to free market parking. And three, I would like to suggest a model that we've seen used overseas that I quite like. Car parks which don't meet certain revenue thresholds could be repurposed for other uses. A great example could be on Courtney Place or near Cuba Street. What we could do is we could auction those off to small businesses, say a food truck. Now, this would have a triple effect. One, it would free up land for small businesses when we're all struggling to pay rent. It would increase competition in the commercial property market, lowering rents for all businesses in the area when businesses are being strangled by their landlords more than ever before. And it would provide a much needed source of revenue for the ratepayer, who's being asked to foot the bill for thousands of subsidised car parks. So thank you for listening, and I hope the council considers my proposals. We're happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Isla. And we do have a couple of questions, and we'll begin with Councillor Young and then Councillor Rush.
Thanks, Isla. So very interesting idea of auctioning off the car parks. I just wonder if you are aware that we have some situations in the council where council in previous decades has allowed people to take 99-year leases on car parks, which has stymied some of our projects to do things like laneways. So, I mean, I would just urge caution on the idea of getting rid of car parks, because you don't really know what it's going to stop you from doing in the future. I would prefer the council keeps control over its assets like that, because there's one laneway in particular. So I said, are you aware of the implications of some of the things you're suggesting? In particular, that one.
Oh, absolutely. I would never support a 99-year lease. If we do auction them off, it should be short-term, and it should be most of the control kept with the council, in my opinion.
Thanks. Okay.
Thank you, Councillor Rush.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's refreshing actually to hear someone who I largely agree with in terms of economic principle and use of market forces. One point I would raise, Isla, is you mentioned about parks not being that productive, but are you also including in that analysis not just the fact that there is a revenue stream from to the City Council for use of that park, but also for the efficiency of people to come into town to be able to shop, to do what they need to do, which then creates an uplift in productivity.
Hey, absolutely. But when I think of car parks, I consider it compared to the opportunity cost of, say, if we could put everyone on a bus and take them in and get a very similar level of productivity. Now, of course, that's not going to happen overnight. But when I say productive, I say compared to alternatives that we could make about with an appropriate, modal shift in transport. If that makes
Sure.
sense. And
Sure. I mean, that added 2 hours to my journey to and from the office. So that would be non-productive time sitting on a bus or waiting for it, etc.
Well, with appropriate investment in transport, it wouldn't take 2 hours, in theory.
All right. Cool. Thank you very much, Isla, for coming in and sharing your ideas with us. It's really interesting to hear them. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Cool. Know my David Perks, who is here today representing Wellington NZ. Thanks, David, for zooming in and being here to kōrero with us. So you've got 10 minutes for your submission, and if you do want to allow some time in there for some questions, that would be really helpful. Thank you.
Kia ora, everybody. Good to see you all. I hope you're going to all get into the city again soon. You look like you're all still sitting at home. Not all of you, perhaps most of you. Hey, our submission is largely about one thing, so I'm probably not going to take 10 minutes of your time at all, so hopefully give you some time back. And I suppose our concern looking at what's being proposed is that there's no addressing the need for coach parking, and coach parking is important in the city for a number of things, and indeed some of the things are things which are close to the council's heart. So when we look at school groups coming into the city for musical events in the Michael Fowler Centre or to Capital E, those school groups come on coaches. There's no provision for parking in the city, or indeed parking close to the city for drivers to take their coaches to some distance, close to the city, but not in the CBD. And of course, that's the same for if we're thinking of conventions, and I am thinking about the new convention centre. Quite rightly, it doesn't have parking because we identified that car parking wasn't required for the convention centre. But what that does mean is that groups of delegates will arrive at the convention and exhibition centre, and that will be on coaches that will bring them from the airport or from other parts of the city. We need somewhere within the city for those coaches to park. The second part of it is that there's very little provision for coaches in close proximity to hotels, and often if groups of visitors are arriving into the city on a coach, which is a frequent thing, those coaches struggle to not only park but actually let their passengers off. So we do think in a world where we're trying to encourage less use of the car, it is important that the council take due consideration of what coach parking requirements are, both short-term parking in the CBD, but also some longer-term parking, so that bus driver that brings a school group into the city for the day has the opportunity to park up their bus and out of the city, but not too far away that it becomes inefficient or just undoable. So that's our submission, and we would like you to think about how coach parking can be embraced by the proposal, which it isn't at the moment. Thanks. Any questions, of course?
Kia ora, David. Thank you for that. Councillors, do you have any questions for David? Same too. Councillor Young?
So thank you, David. How long will it be, do you think, before the coach service that we used to know when we had cruise ships operational, et cetera, how long is it before that market will be fully reactivated?
That's a very good question, Councillor Young. I think cruise will come back, and there's reasons I believe that, and one of them is that the big cruise ship owning companies will want to do something with their cruise ships. I'd be surprised to see it back this coming summer, but it wouldn't surprise me to see it back the following summer with a whole lot of new rules and regulations around its delivery, not just in New Zealand, but globally, that make it a more sustainable sector with the appropriate social working practices and all those things around it.
So then the next question is, you know, living on the edge of the city as I do, you know, I see a lot of these buses. How many of these buses servicing? So I'm not talking about the commuter buses. I'm talking about the sort of the coaches.
Yep.
How many of those are operating in Wellington in total? I mean, obviously not all at one time, but how many of them are there around?
So there's kind of two types of operators. One is our local tour operators, and that of course includes Transit and Hammonds and Rover Tours, and between them I think they would have something like 70 vehicles that they use in and around Wellington and are based in Wellington. But then most of the buses actually come from other places because people are coming to Wellington, whether that's from other parts of the region or further. And of course some tour buses go all the way through New Zealand. School buses probably from the lower North Island, buses coming to events. You know, when we have an All Blacks test on, you'll frequently see buses coming in from all parts of central New Zealand. So that would be in the probably in the thousands of vehicles. They're not all here at once, but one of the points we make in our submission is that at the moment there's kind of a layover area on Kent Terrace, and we see from where this proposal is and the future of Let's Get Welly Moving that effectively that will be removed, and there's no plan to replace it in the plan.
Right, thank you. I just live near that layover area, so I'm very familiar with it. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you. Councillor Rash.
My question was the same as Councillor Young, so thank you for that.
Thank you very much. It's very efficient. Thank you, David, for taking the time to come and korero with us today and helping us understand some of the specific issues around the coaches. Very helpful.
No problem.
Thank you.
Thank
Have
you,
a good
everybody.
afternoon. So I think I'll just check. I don't think we have Hare here at this point. Is that correct, Cyrus? So I've got the answer. That's no. So we're going to move on to Chris Rawson. Tēnā koe, Chris. You're welcome to get underway. So you have 5 minutes, and if you do want to allow time for questions, it needs to be within that 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak to my submission today. My name is Chris Rawson. I live and work in Brooklyn. I ride a motorcycle, and before the COVID lockdown, I was a daily commuter to and from the central city. Wellington City Council has proposed introducing paid parking for motorcyclists in the central city. I am vehemently opposed to this proposal, and I'll explain why in 2 different ways. First, I'll compare the parking services that much more highly populated cities offer to their motorcyclists and see how that weighs up against what Wellington offers. Then I'll relate my experiences as a motorcyclist in Wellington and ask whether Wellington's existing parking scheme is in fact something that's worth paying for. Across the ditch in Melbourne, motorcyclists can just straight up park on the footpath. It even says so on the City Council's website. On top of that, there are over 400 dedicated free parking spaces for motorbikes, with another 150 on the way. Melbourne is a city with a population exceeding that of the entirety of this country, with traffic every bit as dense as that implies. Meanwhile, if you try parking on the footpath in Wellington, even if you're not blocking footpath traffic in any way, you'll get a fine from parking enforcement. New York City allows motorcycles to park anywhere on the side of the road, including in pay and display bays meant for cars. New York City has nearly double the population of New Zealand and is world famous for its cramped roads and terrible traffic, but it still has more lenient rules for parking than we do in Wellington. If you try to park a motorcycle in a pay and display bay here, you'll get a fine from parking enforcement, even if you've paid to use the space. Obviously, we're a much smaller city than either of those two, so naturally we can't expect the same level of service. So what level of service are we getting, and is it worth paying for? Wellington has about 600 parking spaces available throughout the city for motorcycles, and that's it. Even if you pay money to use a pay and display space, you'll still get fined for using it because they're only allowed for cars. That means Wellington's vast army of daily motorcycle and scooter commuters are all competing for an incredibly low number of available spaces. And this council has shown no intention of making things easier for us by giving us more parking. Quite the opposite, actually. Anytime there are roadworks or road closures, the motorcycle bays are often the first thing to go. My experience as a daily motorcycle commuter in this city has been incredibly frustrating. When I worked for the Ministry of Social Development, if I wanted any assurance of having a parking space within a few hundred meters of the offices on the terrace, I had to arrive well before 8:30 a.m. If I didn't, I'd end up spending half an hour or more hunting for a space, if I could even find one at all. When I worked for the Department of Conservation, if I didn't get to the nearby motorcycle bay before 8:10 a.m., I'd once again have to spend half an hour or more hunting for a space. Just a few months back, my girlfriend texted me from her office on the terrace and asked if I could pick up some burger fuel for lunch. I rode from my place in Brooklyn to Cuba Street, parked on a nearby footpath because I had no other choice, fortunately came back a couple minutes later and found no ticket taped to my bike, and then spent, and this isn't an exaggeration, 45 minutes riding in circles through the CBD, trying and failing to find even one free space. In the end, we couldn't have lunch together because time ran out. I dropped her burger off at her office and rode back home. It's reached the point that if I have a job interview or some other time-sensitive thing to do in the CBD at midday, I'll just walk because I know it's virtually guaranteed I won't find parking in a reasonable time or distance from where I need to go. Matter of fact, if this meeting were taking place in person at the Civic Center rather than via Zoom, I would most likely have walked there for this meeting. If this council wants us motorcyclists to start paying for parking, then it needs to start taking us seriously as legitimate road users with the same rights as car drivers. Give us more opportunities for parking, not less. Find ways to let us park on the footpath like Melbourne does, or at least give us the same level of rights as other motorized vehicle users the way New York City and almost every other major city in the world does. And let us use the pay and display parking without fear of reprisal from parking enforcement. But the way things stand now, the parking situation for motorcycles in this city is a joke, and it's not a joke that's anywhere near funny enough to pay for. With over 90% of submissions being opposed to introducing paid parking, I'm obviously not the only one who thinks so. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Chris. I think we're only going to have time for one question, and that will be from Councillor Paul. Thank you.
Hey, kia ora, Chris. I just want to say I empathise with what you're saying. My dad and my grandfather both have Harleys. But I was just wondering, you know, we have a climate emergency on our hands. We declared that last year, and there are targets that come with that emergency, such as halving our emissions by 2030 and then being carbon neutral by 2050. And, you know, that has a heavy cost to it for mitigation, adaptation, and I guess investment in a low carbon economy and transport system. So if we're not charging carbon emitting activities, then who should pay for that work?
The counter that I would make to that is that motorcycles emit far less than cars do. I have a pretty fuel hungry bike, but even the amount of fuel that my bike consumes is about the same as a super low emissions vehicle, like a Toyota Echo is, for example. Most motorcycles will be in the emissions range of about 1/4 of a low emissions vehicle like a Toyota Echo. The first bike that I had was a 650cc motorcycle that got something like 70 miles to the gallon, which I couldn't tell you off the top of my head what that converts to into metric, but it's really good mileage. And there are other benefits to getting more motorcycles on the road as well. You would have less traffic congestion. You can fit anywhere from 6 to 8 motorcycles in the amount of space that one car would take. So, you know, in terms of the emissions side of things, getting more bikes on the road, it can only be a good thing.
So can I just clarify, are you saying that motorbikes typically make up 1/4 of worth of a car's emissions, but you can fit 6 to 8 in one car park? Does that mean we'll get double emissions per one car park?
You would have 6 people traveling within the same amount of space that typically one person would be traveling, and you would have less time spent idling in traffic because you wouldn't have nearly the level of traffic congestion that you do. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Kia ora, Chris, thank you for coming in and sharing your experiences with us. And yeah, feel free to watch the rest of the streaming via the live streaming.
Cool. Thank you.
Kia ora. Kia ora, Mark Johnson. Thank you for waiting for us. So if you'd like to start your presentation and just allow some time for questions within that. It's written down that you've got 5 minutes. It's actually not that clear on some of the submission forms. I'm going to have to follow this up as to whether people are presenting as part of an organisation or as an individual, which has affected how things have been scheduled. So I just want to confirm with you what your understanding was around how long you would be having to present.
I only have 5 minutes. I'm just as an individual today.
You're as an individual, great, thank you. So if you want to allow time for questions, that'll be fantastic, thank you.
Okay, yeah. Kia ora koutou. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to my submission today. Firstly, I'd like to speak in support of the parking policy. Council officers gave a really great presentation at the Newtown Residents Association around the use of parking in the suburb. It showed that they'd done a really great level of in-depth research around street by street where the pressure was highest and how the parking could be made to work better so that it was efficient and not by just throwing more parks at the problem. And the situation in Newtown is quite vexed, so I probably won't have time to cover it in this 5 minutes, so I'll skip that section. I agree with the parking hierarchy, especially around the providing of movement of people through arterial routes, bus priority and moving people on footpaths and on cycleways near the centre of the CBD in places like Adelaide Road and Kent and Cambridge Terraces is a far better use of space than the provision of large amounts of parking along these routes. We could be doing some more things around trying to reduce household car dependency and car numbers. So this policy does address that in terms of things like car sharing, which is companies like Mevo and City Hop, and education around how to live. This is extra to the policy, but education around how to live without a private vehicle if possible. So things like how to shop by bike or micromobility or walking. Bearing in mind that not everyone will do this, just converting a few of those car trips over to bike or walk or micromobility frees up parks and frees up road space for those people who do need to drive or park. A small thing I sort of disagreed with in the policy is that there's some hierarchy around where we provide parking around facilities. And it was just a very small thing that bus stops were prioritised beneath short stay parking. An example of this is at Wakefield Park, where there's a really great playground provided by council and the sporting facilities where I play my football. There's a heap of parking up and down the street, but the bus stop that serves the park is actually not very well situated for accessing the park and the facilities there. It would be great if that bus stop was really close to the changing and play park facilities so that people could get the bus to the play park or get the bus to play football. Just finally, a great bit of news that's coming out of Newtown is that the Newtown Festival organisers are providing some clip-ons to street parking to use those spaces for dining and social distancing, which is going to be a great use of suburban centre street space as we look to revitalise those local businesses post-COVID. Yeah, sorry, I didn't prepare much more than that, so I think that's me. Any questions?
Kia ora, Mark, that's very helpful. Looks like Councillor Rush, have you got a question?
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, something resonated with me about how to shop by bike. So when I was at university with my 7 other flatmates, we all took turns to catch the bus to Karakia actually and do the shopping. So it was about a 2.5 hour round trip. And certainly if I was to do the things that I do on the way to work, which is drop one child at early childhood centre, another at school, and then pick them up on the way back. If I did all that either on foot or on a bike, I'd probably need to add another 2-3 hours to my day. So back at university, of course, my time was quite free. What I'm putting to you, Mark, isn't the use of these types of modes a non-productive use of my time?
I do know people who have families who drop them off on by bike and then go on to work. So it's not. It may be slower if you pedal slower, Sean. So you have to get a few weeks under your belt, and then you start moving a bit faster, and then that makes your time productive.
And the exercise is good for you.
Oh yeah, that too.
Deputy Mayor Free has a question.
Hey, first, I just have to say what a great job Jenny's done on this policy, as well as our staff. Councillor Jenny Condi, she's just done an amazing job explaining it. My question is about bike and scooter parking. Mark, what more could the council be doing to provide, in a simple, if you can sum this up simply, to provide better options for parking for bikes and micromobility?
Yeah, a lot more. I think I tuned into the meeting last week when he discussed scooter docks, so places you can put scooters around the city to help alleviate footpath clutter and things like that. So there's always a stack of scooters outside the railway station which are all tumbled in the wind. Just putting something there to keep them in place would be great. Things along Courtney Place to put them in would be great. The council's actually done a great job of responding to requests for cycle parking, especially out in the suburbs. There's been a few places where they've been put on the street, and obviously always could do more, especially outside high use areas like the supermarkets. Because people just, I mean, you can lock your bike to almost anything, so people tend to just do that. But it can be untidy, and people obviously don't always know if they're getting in the way of pedestrians. Some people are more mindful than others, so putting the bike parking somewhere it's not going to get in the way is pretty good as well, pretty vital. Thanks for the question.
Kia ora, Mark. Thank you very much for answering our partai today. We really appreciate that, and for sharing some of your knowledge about the different areas of Wellington. Really appreciate that. Kia ora, Oliver Bruce. Thank you for coming along today to talk to us about our parking policy. And so you've got 5 minutes, and if you'd like to allow us some time for questions within that, that would be helpful.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much. It's great to be here again. See you all again this week. I'm going to be presenting two things. One is in reference to a session that we did with a group called Urban Nerds, which I started last year. We're a group of urban, as the name suggests, nerds, people into how to make Wellington a better place and better urban setup. If we proceed to the next slide. In early April, we had a Zoom meeting, as you can see there. That was actually towards the end of the meeting after a bunch of people had left. Next slide. In which we had 48 people at peak. We had Councillor Condi come and present specifically on the parking policy. We had 7 breakout rooms in which we broke everybody off and they had a discussion. So I'm just going to present top line feedback from that, which was there was a really strong support around the framing in light of, especially in light of Let's Get Wellington Moving. Acknowledged per people who in the discussion that's gone before, the need to coordinate this with greater access to alternative modes for safe transport, need to prioritise parking for car park spaces, and then car share spaces, and then obviously a bit of a vigorous debate around Newtown connections and making sure that actually goes ahead. So that's that. And then the other part that I really wanted to focus on was a part that came up in the discussion in the document, and it's kind of a wider point around cost recovery in parking. To Isla's point earlier, if we just proceed on, if you look at the I've gone and collected done an IOA on on the total revenue that we collect from revenue parking each year, and this is from the Wellington Council through to 2018. You can see there that we collect on average, it's actually when you combine between the coupon exemption and the revenue and the residence parking, it's around $600,000 a year. If we proceed to the next point. And yet, if we were to assume a $30 a week, if I was to go out and rent a car park anywhere in these suburbs that has on-street car parking where residents car parking applies, the average price is actually in the region of about $60 to $75. I'm being kind of generous there, around the $30. But it's to the tune of about sort of $10 to $11 million a year in terms of opportunity cost that we're missing out on if we were to charge a fair market rent for what is currently considered to be car parking that's provided by the council to the residents of those suburbs. Next slide. Oh, right. Okay. All right. So this is an earlier version of the presentation. The key point that I really want to make is that on average, we're only recovering between 3 and 7% of the current cost in terms of opportunity cost that exists. And I would encourage the council to consider the fact that cost recovery can actually include opportunity cost as well. I'm not advocating that we go out and collect, the equivalent of $30 a week for all residents, but just that is in the back of our mind as we make a decision about the fact that the fact that, look, this is all real estate. Real estate on roads is real estate that is owned by the council. And with a lot of the pushback being that, hey, look, it's crazy that we're even charging $200 a year. Yes, perhaps to some residents, but actually the market rent for that land is in the tune of about $1,500 a year. And that we should be thinking about that as we look to make decisions around car parking in Wellington. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Thank you. We have a partai from Councillor Rush.
Thanks for that. Hey, look, I'm just a bit concerned that putting up the price of parking in residence zones will lead to further inequality because I think fairly wealthy people will pay a bit more and it won't really affect them. They'll carry on parking, but people who are maybe renting but need their car to get to their job will struggle. So have you any comment to that?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is always on one hand, you were supportive of Isla around her idea of making the car parks more reasonably priced according to free market policies. And on the other hand, we turn around and we say, well, that's not going to apply to residents. I think it needs to apply across the city whenever we're making these decisions, right? And of course, there's going to be people who lose out on this, and renters especially. I'm a renter. I mean, at the moment, I get free car parks because I live in Roseneath, but I got coupon exemptions when I lived down in Oriental Bay. That's just a decision making that would have to go in to whenever you go to choose to live or rent in a particular area, and that's something that just factors into a decision making process. Alternatively, an e-bike costs $1/4 to run than a car, so people can still have options to be able to get around Wellington.
Thank you, Councillor Pennant.
Hey, thanks, Oliver. That's a great submission. Any thinking about how we change people's thinking about public space and who's got the rights to use it, because this has been a very difficult issue to deal with?
Yeah, and I'm really aware. I was there was a news article that came up last year when there was the discussion around moving pricing from being $100 a year to $200 a year, and there were obviously residents upset about that. My take on this is we need to just get out. I mean, this is an opportunity for council to take more courageous action around this and say, look, the real price of this, if we were to say this is fair market rents for the space that's on the road, and we were to allocate that according to market prices, it would be in the region of $1,500 a year. That's what it costs to rent a private car park up in Roseneath. That's what it costs to, or any of these other suburbs that currently have off-street car park, on-street but residence parking. We can't do that under the Local Government Act because we need to do reasonable cost, but opportunity cost is actually very high. And so whenever we're talking about this, we need to be thinking of framing it in terms of opportunity cost. The other way to also look at it would be to follow what Patrick was talking about with Donald Shoup, and to say, we can charge market rents for this, and we'll work at how to provide that as a rates rebate to those particular areas. So if we are to charge $1,500 a year for that car parking, but we'll give you a discount on your rates as an overall neighborhood, then I think that could also change the nature of that discussion.
Thank you. We've just got one more person after this, and two haven't turned up. So I am actually just going to allow Mayor Foster, you haven't asked a question yet. You can ask your question if you can be really quick.
Thank you. I always like it when people talk about market pricing of anything. So two quick ones. Your graph, Oliver, said that we were getting less money from coupon parking than from resident parking at the moment. Your first graph, which surprised me because
coupon exemption parking. So yeah, because
okay, yeah, right, okay, coupon park. Okay, because at the moment our coupon parks are, yeah, that one. It's coupon exemption, is it?
Yeah. Yeah,
okay,
sorry, the one
not
before
coupon,
that.
yeah, sorry, okay, I misheard that. Okay, so because at the moment a coupon park theoretically could earn about $3,000 a year if it was fully
Yes.
occupied.
Absolutely, and I've actually got the figures on that.
Comment on that, given your market values.
Totally, yeah, and I actually have got that data and haven't finished crunching it, but I will, and when I do that, I will write a blog post and share that with you. But it is to the tune of, you know, one of the frustrating things for me, I lived in Oriental Bay, I paid $2.17 a week for my coupon exemption, and I know that that car park was worth $3,000 a year, so I paid, you know, I effectively paid $100 on something that was worth $3,000, and just as a, you know, I'm very happy to accept that. But I think it's deeply unfair for Wellington taxpayers that I got that for free. So
just finally on that, in terms of our priority order, when it comes to, it's particularly the inner suburbs, do you think we should be, I can't remember where we put resident ahead of coupon or vice versa, but do you think we should have a bit of a think about that unless we change the dollar numbers?
Yeah, I look, at the end of the day, I think, you know, residents parking for $100 for one car, totally fine if people have, you know, people have bought the house on that basis, right? But for a second car, and then for coupon exemptions, especially for when you've got, you know, 3 or 4 people in the house who have all got coupon exemptions, you have to think about the opportunity cost, right? That's provided when we go out and provide those coupon exemptions. And I have the data. I'm very happy to share it of what that is, especially when you consider it against the fact that at the moment we lose out on that revenue.
Thank you.
Ngā mihi, Oliver. Thank you for sharing your wealth of knowledge with us. Really appreciate you taking the time to do that today.
That's welcome.
Kia ora, Chris Prowse. You are our lucky last presenter today. Thank you for waiting patiently, and you have 5 minutes, so if you'd like to allow time for some questions within that, that would be very much appreciated.
Thank you very much for having me and giving me the opportunity to comment on the policy development. I've really got one key point really, and a couple of sort of sub points. And the major point is that what I'd like the council to think about is providing a safe two-way corridor from the suburbs, particularly those suburbs that are close to the city, because there's a problem which I'm sure you're all aware of, and that's commuter parkers parking in these streets. And a lot of these streets now are down to sort of one lane in many parts, and it's causing blockages. I think there's safety issues as well. So looking at the particular suburb that I live in, and that's Northland, I sort of suspect, particularly the Northlands case, it wouldn't be that hard to actually do, because we have a main road out called Northland Tunnel Road, and that goes into Raroa Crescent. And both of those roads actually have no residential requirements at all. There's no houses or buildings. There's no requirement for residential parking. So those particular roads could be made either yellow lined or could have clearways during the daytime or whatever. And that would provide two ways. And I'm sure that even the bus drivers would support that, because they struggle with this particular area. If this was done, I would suspect they might have to have a look at Northland Tunnel Road where that intersects with Raroa Crescent. It might need traffic lights there, because it's quite a dangerous crossroad there as cars whip up and down, particularly Raroa Road. So that's my main point. My other points, I guess, if I look at some of the other roads, which are harder to fix because of the residential requirements there, but some of the roads in particular, like Northland Road, are getting quite dangerous now, particularly with the blind corners. There's blockages, you know, cars are having to drive up on footpaths. I've even heard residents, sort of pedestrians, complaining because they can't push their prams past cars which are having to park up on the footpath, etc. So I suspect there's a requirement there for more yellow lines, particularly on some of those dangerous corners where you're sort of driving blind around them. I guess overall, if you're looking at, particularly again, say somewhere like Northland, there are some other things to think about, which I think came up in the policy papers that were commented on. Obviously things like more coupon parking can help, I guess, and to deter people from, particularly the commuters, from parking in the area. there's clearways during the day, more yellow lines. There's other things that can be thought about too. There's Appleton Park, which already has parking for Zealandia. I mean, there could be a patch of that park used for, set aside for commuter parking, which again would help sort of clear the main entrances in and out of Northland, and perhaps might help some of the other areas like Karakia as well. So I guess my major point really is thinking about if we can provide a safe two-way corridor from those suburbs in the city which are affected by particularly commuter parkers during the business hours. So that's really my key point. I'm happy to answer any questions or that people may have.
Thank you, Chris. And we do have definitely one question. So we've got a partai from Councillor Wolf. You seem to be muted still, Councillor Wolf, even though it's not showing mute on the thing.
How's that?
That's better, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, sorry about that, Chris. Thank you for what you do in our community, and particularly around safety and vehicle safety. I know that you've been a really strong advocate right over my 6 years. My question is, you've mentioned certain roads like Railroad Road, Northland Road, and also Garden Road. It's been my observation recently, well, not just recently, that cars are coming in and parking there from outside of Wellington and then using public transport or cycles. Is that something that you've observed as well?
Yeah, well, I mean, the real acid test, I guess, was during alert level 4. There were no cars parked in Northland Tunnel Road or Railroad Crescent. I suspect there was a change in places like Garden Road and Northland Road, where there was a lot of residential parking because people weren't taking their cars to work. But that was replacing the commuter parkers during the day. But there certainly is a lot of commuter parkers in that area, and for the obvious reason, they can walk to work from that area, or I suspect a number of them too are parking there and then moving on to the university. But yeah, during alert level 4, there were Northland Tunnel Road was absolutely clear. No cars could be seen.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And again, you do a wonderful job in our community. Just like to have that acknowledged in front of my council colleagues.
Oh, well, thank you.
Good acknowledgement. Thank you. And we do have one more partai from Councillor Rush, if you can be really quick, because we are over.
Very quick.
Over a little bit.
So totally get where you're coming from. Roseneath and Hataitai also suffer from people using our streets as park and rides. I've got a slightly different focus though, because like Northland, we're very hilly here too. And I remember Railroad Road from my university days. What's the cycling uptake up and down Railroad Road been like over the last few months and over the last few years?
Well, from my experience, you notice it actually more on the weekend coming up Railroad Road. And that's, I guess, people get out for exercise during the weekend. It's not actually that bad during the week for cyclists. There was a little bit more traffic, of course, during the alert levels and whatnot when people were getting exercise. But generally, no, there's not a lot of cycle traffic up Railroad Road. It's quite steep, obviously. So it's a bit of a push up there.
Oh, thank you very much. And ngā mihi, Chris, for sharing your thoughts with us today. Really appreciate that.
Oh, thank you for having me. Thank you.
Oh. All right, ngā mihi ki a koutou i te whakaaro. So thank you to all of our manihere, our submitters today, for sharing their views and their experiences with us. We really appreciate that. And thank you, councillors, for your fantastic partai, and also to our staff who have sat here and listened through this as well, and for the work that they're doing in the background. Thank you very much. So me whakakapi tēnei hui. Didn't expect to feel an earthquake during the during this process, but it looks like it's finished now.
You're just as composed as Jacinda was, Jill.
I was generally don't feel it down in this room, so yeah, it must have been a bit of a shake. Thank you. So my councillor Paul te Karakia e mutunga, and we can all go and have some time to relax.
Me Karakia. Okay, kapai. Aroha mai is just a bit shaken and thrown off by that. We're on stilts in the Aro Valley, so we feel it real hard here. All right. Mēnoi tātou. Unuhia wetewetea ngā tāmitanga o te wā, ngā kaupēhitanga o te wā, ngā herenga o te wā. Kia wātea te ngākau, kia wātea te tinana, kia wātea te wairua. Tomokia e tāne. Tāne te waiora, tāne te whakaputa nei. Ki te whai ao, ki te ao marama, e rongo whakairea, tūturu whiti whakamaua kia tīna, tīna. Haumi e, hui e, tai ki e.
Ngā mihi, Councillor Paul. Thank you. Councillor Paul asked if she could do a different karakia, and that karakia is acknowledging Tāne, Tāne Mahuta, the god of the forest. So I think that's beautiful. Thank you. Well, you all kept your composure really well. So Councillor Young has just informed us that was a 4.9. Where was it centred? Do you know?
Levin, same spot. Thank you.
Levin. Oh, okay.
Didn't feel it.
So it says 5.2 on GNS. It just
so I
became
guess it's a good opportunity now to remind anyone who's watching this to make sure that they've got their water tank sorted. I'm sure Councillor Sparrow will be encouraging that too. These are good reminders to us to make sure that we are well prepared at any time. But I hope everybody has a good afternoon, and yeah, we'll probably have some more submissions coming soon. So thank you.